Hi there. Greeting once again. This is Clifford Bates, and welcome to another session of reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we are turning to chapter 5 of book 6, which is wrapping up, I think, the wrapping up of the section of democracy about the institution of installing or creating a democracy. So let's turn to this, chapter 5. But instituting it is not the greatest task or the only task of the legislature or of those wanting to constitute some regime of this sort, but rather to see that it is preserved. For it is not difficult to be governed in one fashion or another for 1 or 2 or 3 days. So, in other words, he repeats something he breaks up all the way in the beginning of book 4, the introduction of book 4, about that it's, setting regimes is, establishing, in other words, preserving regimes or maintaining them or, seeing how they run, their perpetuation, hence, therefore, governing properly over time is more difficult and more important for the study of politics than necessarily legislating, creating a regime. Because why? He's saying that it's not difficult to be governed in one fashion or another for 1 or 2 or 3 days. You can create, in other words, it's perpetuation of the thing, of creating of an order. So it's not the greatest task to create something. It's rather the great task that's to see something that you've created preserve or be perpetuated. Okay. So let's continue here. So hence, one should take what was studied earlier, the sources of preservation and destruction of regime, which is again book 5, right? What we learned in book 5, all the things that we learned in book 5, chapters 1 through 4, which dealt 1 through 4, which dealt with the general situations of regimes. Then book chapters 5, 6, and 7 about the different the different specific regimes and what leads to their deviations and or things that destroy them, destruction, or leads them to change from things that will cause them to change from that regime to something else. And then 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, chapter 8 and 9, which dealt with the question of preservation, what things are preservation. And then the 9 and 10, 10 and 11, which dealt with the question of things that cause change in monarchy and preservation of monarchy and tyranny, right? Things that cause change and destruction of monarchies, that kingships and tyrannies, and those that in chapter 11, preservation of, with very short, brief introduction on preserving kingship and a longer discussion in chapter 11 of that. And then that was book 5. So in other words, we should go back and look at that, right? And to try to institute stability. So not only go back there and look at the question of what is try to institute stability, avoiding what destroys regimes, and enacting laws, both written and unwritten, of a sort that will encompass above all what preserves regimes. And one should not consider as characteristic of popular, in other words, semicolon, and one should not consider as characteristic of popular rule or of oligarchy something that will make the city democratically or oligarchically run to the greatest extent possible, but something that will do so for the longest period of time. So, in other words, what you should concern yourself is not to making it more and more democratic. That's not. In other words, we should look um, to what allows the regime to perpetuate itself over the greatest possible period of time. Therefore, we should pass laws. We should make laws, both written and unwritten, that will preserve the regime, and not consider another. And he said, what we should not do, particularly popular rule or oligarchical rule, making it more so, in other words, making things extremely democratic or extremely oligarchic will lead to the undermining of both of those, of the oligarchy, the ability of the oligarchy to preserve itself, or the ability of the popular rule to preserve itself. In other words, you don't make it more and more popular, make it more and more democratic. This can actually even ultimately destroy, leads to its instability. Like, in other words, again, this leads us to the principle that was not only discussed here in the earlier chapters about democracy. In other words, that the take and something that was very much highlighted, both of what leads to democratic instability is the radicalization of democracy, of expanding democracy to groups or areas that will lead it to become more unstable and will lead it to become more tyrannical. Okay, and whereas for oligarchy, the same principle, as the principle of oligarchy is fewer and fewer and fewer to the principle of only one ruling, tyranny. So therefore, this is the danger here of this, that we, and therefore making it more truly popular or democratic, or truly more oligarchic, only ends up destabilizing these regimes. And this is the lesson that he's taught earlier. Now, this is we must remember this, and therefore, what was more important is the preservation, the longevity of a regime, making it being able to preserve itself, right? So therefore, making it able to be its longevity, not its more being more perfect of a regime of the regime. In fact, that's one of the criticisms Aristotle seems to have, is that if you take democracy or oligarchy, either of those principles, and take it to its extreme, this leads to not the justness of the regime, but the injustice of the regime. And again, remember, that is why the subvariations of democracy and oligarchy at the extreme. So this is what we have to be careful about. Okay, the question of what stabilizes the longest period of time. So in other words, now he says there, and it continues: popular leaders of the present, the demagogues. That's what popular leader means. Remember, seeking to win favor of the people, undertake many confiscations through the courts. Those who cherish the regime should take action against this. In other words, legislating that nothing that is confiscated in the case affecting common matters should become public property, but rather sacred property. In other words, this is something he talks about. This is a suggestion. In other words, the tendency of demagogues, the popular leaders, wishing to flatter democracy, rather to flatter the demos in that sense, the will what is it? Win favor of the people by confiscating stuff through the courts, and this is dangerous. Why? Because it destabilizes the regime. He says this is not good. In other words, in order to flatter the people, to get more and more, to encourage them to become more and more democratic, to radicalize the democracy, this ultimately destabilizes the regime. He says here. And that therefore, if that's the case, it shouldn't be public property to aggrandize the power, make the regime more grandized, giving it more power, giving it more, taking it. Rather, it should be sacred property. In other words, something, okay, if we're going to take away this, then that should be something that, okay, we can't touch it for this. Those acting unjustly will, will be no less cautious, for they will be fined in the same way. But the masses will less frequently vote against those who are being tried, as they are not going to get anything out of it. Okay, this is the thing. If all of a sudden what happens here is this, the money will be taken away, right? The money will be confiscated, but it's not going to be given to the people to spend. In other words, the people won't profit from it. It will be put for the holy, that we don't just sit there and wait, can't do anything with it. So we punish the guilty. In other words, those acting unjustly, those of the few who act unjustly, will be punished. That will, if they're really unjust. But there's no incentive. In other words, because the poor won't get the goodies from the money to be able to use it to enjoy it, or to profit from it. Therefore, they will not so much be willing to convict. If I'm going to profit from it, of course I'm going to convict. I'd be likely to convict. I'm going to be more likely to get. If I gave every juror was going to get something from the conviction, of course the juror is going to say, okay, guilty. But if I'm not going to get something from it, I might just not necessarily be as. In other words, this is the danger of the confiscation of goods through the courts, because it leads to what by using the courts. This is one of the things we have to say: the danger of using the courts, legal systems for political ends. Once you start using legal systems as weapon of partisan conflict, what will happen is then therefore no one will respect justice anymore. The parties won't respect. See, justice is the idea that justice and the courts have anything to do is that they're delivering justice. That the courts are delivering what the law and what justice requires, fairness. But if they're not, if they're seen as agents of various partisans, then it's no longer seen as doing justice. It becomes rather a tool of the partisans. Okay, this is one of the dangers in our modern world, where the court is being used politically. Now you can say, "Oh, this is but this has been done by both sides. This is not a universe. In fact, sometimes the danger here is that those who and those who then try to reform it will be accused of influencing the court politically. In other words, this is the problem: is that law is always going to be a tool of the regime. So therefore, therefore, this is that weird aspect of this. The court is a instrument of the regime, and what therefore its legitimacy becomes by its what? It's apparently delivering justice, fairness, and but the longevity here is by doing what? Not, in other words, it should kind of moderate to it. Justice here would be a moderation of the principle of the regime, not an exaggeration. So when the court does something which pushes the envelope of a democrat in a democracy, if the court starts doing pushing that makes things more that benefits the democratic group at the expense of the other group, it becomes seen as more and more a partisan, and its legitimacy becomes problematicized in that sense. And this is what he said here, right? So therefore, this is why we should be careful about this, right? They're not going to get anything out of it. Further, public suits, now this is that thing, right, should always be kept as few as possible. Those persecuting in a frivolous way being curbed by large penalty. In other words, you shouldn't have it that they're illegal allowing frivolous lawsuits. In other words, you need to make it those who are introducing frivolous lawsuits should be penalized. Okay, for they customarily bring these against the notables rather than the popular sort. In other words, the lawsuits are usually aimed at the notables, the better things, the richer, right, than of the people, right, against the people. But all of the citizens should feel benevolent towards the regime. Again, this is what he said about earlier, back in Book 5, Chapter uh, 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 8 and 9, right? About the nature of what preserves the regime. They need benevolence. They should carry both sides, both so all the citizens should be. Or failing this, they should not. They should at least not consider those in authority as their enemies. Again, if they see those in authority as their enemies, that's going to lead to. Therefore, this is one of the big problems of, let's say, in America, the perception of those who are authorities as their enemies of people. Okay, this is what the dangerous element, and therefore they perpetuate they once those who are in authority engage in behavior which make people feel that they're the enemy, then this delegitimizes, this destabilizes the regime. Let's continue. Since the ultimate sort of democracy, remember this, the ultimate sort of is that last democracy, right, have a considerable population, and it is difficult for them to attend the assemblies without pay. This state of affairs, where they do not happen to be external sources of revenue, is inimical to the notables. In other words, if there's not, they don't happen to have external sources of revenues. In other words, revenues, there's not this external source of revenues. And the only way you can get revenues is by taking the notables, going after the better, going after the wealthy, going after the powerful. Okay. In other words, it's going to be different. The ultimate sort of democracy, where the people are going to be a big population, they're going to be democracy, and and it's going to be different. They have to pay. You know, for them to attend and participate, you need to make it pay them to do so. And it's not. In other words, this is inimical. He says this is dangerous for them, for it must necessarily be gotten from taxes and confiscations, and the corruptions of the court, things which have before now brought down many democracies. So therefore, these doing these things will only lead people who have been harmed by them to see them as the enemies of democracy. Um, where there do not where these things do not happen to be where there do not happen to be revenues. Okay, there's no revenues for such things. Then one should hold few assemblies, and the court should have many members, but meet only a few days. In other words, if you don't have if there's no external revenues, and the only way you're going to have this, then you should try to limit have assemblies, limit the assemblies, limit when the court is in session, to kind of limit what can the abuses by the court and the assemblies. This contributes to the wealthy not fearing the expenditure. If the well-off do not receive pay for attending court, but the poor do, okay? In other words, if the wealthy don't get this, and if it contributes to a much better judgment of suits, for the well-off are unwilling to be away from their private affairs for many days, but are willing for a brief period of time. In other words, so therefore, you can only have it. You only have it that the things are going to have meetings very few days. Courts are going to only be like one day. One day. This will allow them the wealthy. If the wealthy aren't going to get paid to come there, they can afford to miss one day. But they can't miss 4, 6, 7, 8, 10 days, right? And therefore they can protect their interests, right? So that they are willing for a brief period of time, to tend their matters. Where there are revenues, however, one should not do what popular leaders do at present. In other words, if there are revenues, right, they distribute any surplus. They distribute any surplus. The people take it, and at the same time ask for more of the same. So if you have a surplus, this is a sort of this sort of assistance is the proverbial to the poor is the punctured jar. This is again the jar that has a hole on it. Let's see. The illusion is the myth of the daughter of Danas who were punished in Hades for murdering their husbands by having to pour water in a leaky jar. Right? This is that famous myth, the punctured jar. Again, this is also a reference from a discussion from Plato and the Gorgias about this. This is listen himself. The proverbial jar, in other words, this myth. Now, again, that myth is an example of that in Hades, people being punished because they murdered their husbands. So they have to get water, and what happens is they get water, the jars leak, so it's perpetual, right? A kind of Sisyphusian task, right? Um, uh, this is a dangerous thing that once you shouldn't do this. If you're going to give money, if you have surpluses, don't just give the surpluses to the poor because they're going to want more. And that means what? Well, once the surplus is gone, you have to do what? You have to do what? Take it from those who have it. And that leads us to the instability. In other words, this creates a war. The rich become fearful that are being targeted by the instruments of the court, and therefore they become the enemy of the regime. Okay, um, but one who is generally, but one who is generally of the popular sort should see that the multitude is not overly poor. Again, so make sure the poor. You have to make sure that the multitude isn't overly poor. For this is the reason for democracies being depraved. Okay, if the people are too poor, then the regime it's going to be very difficult to have a stable democracy. Again, this is what is the famous argument of Lipset, right? This is even though I think Lipset is wrong, Martin Singer Lipset is wrong in arguing that this is all this idea of the educated professional middle class. Ooh, no, it's about this is more the argument of earlier poverty. In other words, having enough means. This is in other words, the problem is poverty. Poverty is not, again, this is a question. Too poor leads what? They become slavish. And if you're too slavish, you will not respect the law. People who are slavish or who are overtly slavish, again, this goes back to chapter 4, book 4, chapter 11, we talks about the rich and the poor, right? The poor, the very poor are slavish. The very rich are arrogant, right? Both of these groups are detrimental. The arrogance and the slavishness of both these groups will destroy a regime. These are the destabilizing factors. Therefore, one should prevent that. You should encourage that there is what? Again, the poor would just want to be left alone. So therefore, as long as the poor can make money, the poor can are able to find themselves. You create means by which the poor are able to by themselves do this, and this makes sure the very poor are cared for to some degree, but not to the extent that they are always what asking for more and more and more and more. Okay, that's the problem here, right? In other words, we need if a democracy has to be one to watch out for the excessive poverty, creating new poverty. This is the stupidity of modern democracies of having open borders. Having open borders only creates a poverty class, increases a class of poverty people who are demanding of services and that. This is the help. This is what the why the and if that you have a population of such people and they're so numerous, this creates what? An unstable political structure that will always have people trying to buy their support by promising stuff to them. Okay, and that is only a recipe for the disaster. Aristotle says here. Measures must be devised so that there will be abundance over time. So, therefore, again, you need measures to create abundance. It's going to be a democratic regime. Democratic regimes require abundance, but not the abundance at the expense of the notables or the wealthy, but rather using them to generate things abundance by which then the poor can be made better, right? Since it is advantageous also for the well off, what ought to be done is to accumulate what is left over of the revenues and distribute accumulated sums to the poor. So not just surpluses, but accumulated sums, interest, some kind of revenue. This should particularly be done if one could accumulate, in other words, this should be done if one could accumulate enough for the acquisition of a plot of land, or failing this, starting a trade or farming. There was some skill, something, saying that, in other words, just don't give them money. You give them what? Piece of land that they can work, or some kind of skill or business, something that they can do. Okay. In other words, it should be done, accumulate enough for an acquisition of something, some capital that they can engage in. If this is not possible for all, it should be distributed on the basis of tribes. In other words, by tribes he means here the various in the sub-community districts, the very districts and that, or some other part of the city by turns. In other words, some kind of mechanism, so distributed by tribes or some other region or district. Not, in other words, if you can't give everyone it, then you should select certain groups based upon geographic. In other words, the way the city is divided, or the political community is divided in turns. And in the meantime, the well-off should be taxed to provide pay for necessary meetings, while at the same time being released from pointless sorts of public service. In other words, don't make them do pointless public service. Only make them provide for necessary things, right? It is by governing in such a manner that the Carthaginians have acquired the friendship of the people, multitude. They are constantly sending out some of the people to be to the subject cities and making all of them well off. Again, this is chapter 11, particularly section 15 in book 2. So this is again, this is that weird, this Carthaginian, an oligarchic regime, which some people hold to be an oligarchic regime. This is how that they are able to win the friendship of the people. In other words, by what? By allowing them to be wealthy, giving them, encouraging them to go to subject cities and making them well off, sending out people to subject cities and making them well off. Okay, this is how the British maintained their interests on population. Empire is a mechanism sometimes of addressing some aspects of poor. Also, notables who are refined and sensible will divide the poor among themselves and provide them with a start in pursuing some work. So, in other words, charity or something like this. In other words, if the notables who are refined and sensible will start taking care of the poor, trying to make them better. Why? They will provide them with some start in pursuing some work. They will divide them and then provide them with some kind of thing to do, something to make them better, something to start their lives off. It is also right to imitate what the Tarentines do by making their possessions common for the use of the poor. They maintain the benevolence of the multitude. Now, 20 here, this is nothing is known in duration. Was Tarentinium was a colony of Sparta. However, it is likely that the practice of common use of property there was similar to Spartan practice of that. There were certain common activities. Again, um, Book 2, Chapter 5, particularly paragraph 7 and 8. And that, again, this is what, in other words, the Tartanite practices, they do something, they have some common, it is imitate, they have to take some of their possessions for common use that even the people, that the poor can participate in and enjoy it and get some, in other words, they maintain the benevolence of the multi, they do things for them. Further, they also created all the offices in a double form, one chosen by election, the other by lot. Okay, there's those chosen by lot so that the people could take part in them, and chosen by election so that they could be well governed. This same thing can be done by splitting the same office between different persons, but chosen by lot and by election. Um, Now, Lord says the meaning of this is uncertain. Aristotle is generally taken to argue that the offices of Tantum are two kinds, those chosen by election and those chosen by lot. Yet such an arrangement would not have been particularly distinctive, right? He's saying. In the precise language used would seem to suggest instead of each office had both an elective component and one chosen by lot, a popular overseer on the Spartan model. If this interpretation is correct, Aristotle's parenthetical remark would also seem to be understood as referencing to rotation in office rather than simultaneously sharing office by officials chosen by lot and election. So again, the question of if this is correct, it's this idea of rotation. In other words, the rotation of the office, and then by election, not simultaneously. Um, I think this is again what's saying here. Aristotle is saying here what you need to do is if you need to have them. There's both groups get a sense, and there's going to be certain office holders are held as popular, and therefore that, and there's a check. In other words, they're able to check and balance the two sides. Again, this is the whole point about what balance is, and the checks and balance. Um, Now he ends this here. The next thing is now how democracy should be instituted then has been spoken of. Therefore, he ends the discussion of, with this, he ends the discussion of instituting how democracies are instituted. So we'll stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in the link below. And when I see them, I will respond to them. If you like the video, like it, please like it. Share with friends, and share on social media and get this out there. If you have not subscribed, subscribe. If you encourage a friend to subscribe. If you liked it, all right. If you didn't like it, You can say no, but say, but say why in the comments. What the criticisms of things are, um, and I will try to address and maybe improve. Um, you can follow me if you want to follow me on social media. You can follow the links below. If you want to help me out doing this financially a little bit, you can do subscribe to our Patreon. Now, of course, you're going to say, oh, I can look at no one's in there, and this is too late in this, and I'm not big enough. I don't think I have thousands. I only have like 20, maybe 30 people watching. I wish too bad not more are interested in this, but it is what it is. Um, Another way you can help if pass it is buying a copy of this. Again, most people probably already who've watched it and regularly watching it probably already have done this. But encourage others to watch these things and look at this series. And if you have not bought it, please think about it. This would be a way to help. This is not a commentary. It's my other early two books, and the next book I'm working on is on. But rather, this is about a kind of a Cliff's Notes, right? A study guide, something to help you, a student studying the politics, go through it both book by book, chapter by chapter, with charts, graphs, outline points, some hints, and some referencing assistance for looking at students who are interested in trying to do something. Again, you can get it through Lulu. If you order Lulu, I'll get what the bookstore would get. A bookstore would get if you buy it by Barnes and Noble or Amazon or those. Okay, they keep a profit. Now, if you buy it by Lulu directly, I will get what Amazon and those get. But if you buy it by that, I'll still get something. So whatever way you buy it, buy it. I understand why people might choose Amazon or other places because they say it's free shipping, and Lulu probably charges for shipping. It's charges for shipping. But if you want to help me directly, do buy it Lulu. Thank you. That's it. Next we look at oligarchy in chapter 6, and therefore we'll see you then. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye bye.